Hi, and welcome to the next instalment of my podcast, which is called Prism, Inside the Creative Mind. My name is Tania Frazer. I am an oboe player, a musician, and an artistic director of Southern Cross Soloists. Today, my guest is somebody who has had the most varied career that spanned at least 3 continents, maybe even more, and someone I've known since I was 18, and I'm very excited that he's back here in Australia and that we can have a chat with him today. And I'd like to introduce you to him. It's Bernard Lanskey, who is now the director of the Queensland Conservatorium of Music, Griffith University. Hi, Bernard.
Hi, Tania.
Lovely
Great to see you again.
Yeah,
yes.
Lovely to see you again.
Great.
So, Bernard, I met you on the second day after I stepped off the plane.
Oh, wow.
In London, back in the late 80s. I'd just come to study at the Guildhall School of Music, and I think you met me because were you the head of international students back then, or what was your role?
Well, actually, it was possibly that I must have been pretty early at Guildhall as well.
I think so,
Because I had a very bizarre introduction to Guildhall in that my first role there was in fact overseeing welfare alongside doing some sessional teaching. So I might have met you because I was in the welfare office rather than because I was in the academic area.
So.
I don't remember this at all. But
no, I think so, because
really
you came and said, "Oh, you're Australian, and welcome, and if you need anything, just let me know." And,
that's probably it.
So it was fantastic to meet you there on my first day. But what's amazing is you're actually from Cairns,
yes,
correct?
Yep.
And so tell me, how did you get from Cairns? Well, first of all, how did you get from Cairns to the Guildhall School of Music in London?
Right.
And then the rest, we'll find out about the rest later. But
sure.
Yeah.
Well, Cairns was a really fantastic environment to be growing up in music, because if you played the piano, you did everything. So I was the cathedral organist at 16. Wow. I was, which I wasn't a very good cathedral organist, but I was playing in jazz bands, and I was not very good at jazz. I was playing in a bar, and I literally was getting the music to be able to play through it when I didn't know the songs, and all the patrons did. And so it was all the way across the board. I was in a pop band. I was writing my own music. And then I was doing classical music. I was doing classical piano as well. But my piano teacher up there, Joan O'Donnell, was really open to this idea that you should be exploring as many genres as possible. I mean, one of the crazier things I did, I was actually a repetiteur for Georg Tintner at Innisfail Conservatorium's summer opera thing.
Okay.
And it was the Bartered Bride. I don't think I knew what bartered meant, and I surely didn't know what repetiteur meant.
No.
So I must have been really terrible for him. But in terms of immersion and getting some exposure to diversity of music, it was completely fantastic. And at none of that time was I expecting I was going to go on to music as a career.
Oh, really? You didn't?
Yeah, no, I was looking at really until the very last minute, and in a context where I could have done it, I was looking at medicine as a way forward.
Okay.
And ironically, I wanted to do psychiatry, but I found out that it would take 9 years of training. And so I thought, well, that's a bit crazy. So I ended up taking at least 9 years to do music.
Yes,
but
exactly. I know, I've thought the same thing when I've looked at university courses. I'm like going, oh gosh, I'm not going to
take that long. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Not at all. Did you go through the whole Stedford scene up there?
Yes, I did, and and some of that was really interesting as well. I still remember doing a medley of 3 modern numbers, which were all built around love. So the first one was definitely Love is Blue, and the second one was the theme from Love Story. I can't quite remember what the third piece was, but the really interesting thing was these pieces were only 3 or 4 years old, and they were common parlance that people knew these songs. So it's really interesting to see how there's the risk that over time we've got less connected to the contemporary, even within the popular field. So that idea of a shared music across a large group of people reaching all the way up into rural Queensland, I think that's something that's been
lost a
slightly
bit.
compromised recently.
Actually, I'm amazed when you say you did all that amount of other styles of music. I didn't really do that. I did try to play the piano in my big band at high school, but I just couldn't. I mean, it was just really tricky. I just couldn't sight read the chords that quickly. So yeah, I was just, oboe, piano and clarinet.
Well, once you're oboe, everybody wants you to
Well,
play the oboe.
exactly.
So I couldn't play the oboe.
Exactly.
So there we are. That's how I got these opportunities.
But my non-classical was all coming from the other side of my hobbies, which was dance. So I was, did ballet, jazz, contemporary, all that sort of stuff. So that's where I was more exposed to that.
Yeah. I mean, the other one that was really important for me was at school. I was actually able to MD some stuff. So. And some of it was ridiculous. I mean, we did a sort of mini. Don't tell the producers, but we did a mini version of Jesus Christ Superstar when I was 16, which was only excerpted. It wasn't the full show.
Yeah.
But if you're playing that, you certainly get some insight as to some feeling, actually, rather than insight, as to what music's about. But all of it was sort of at a subconscious rather than conscious level.
Yeah.
And I was just basically in all of it not very good. But I was getting exposed.
But I mean,
passionate.
I mean, you can't be an expert at anything before you're 18 anyway. But so you decided not to do medicine, not to actually earn lots of money doing medicine, and you went to the UQ to study?
I went to UQ,
Was that with Max Oldham?
No, actually. So Max was really important in my life because when I was 14, he came up to Townsville to do a Music Teachers Association intensive course. And I was a 14-year-old allowed to come and join that. These days you probably wouldn't be allowed because there'd be duty of care issues and so on. But I was literally staying in James Cook University and going home at night and writing up all my notes. And actually one of the reasons I'm back here at Queensland Con was the influence of people like Max and Nancy Weir, who would come north and find people like me and give their time really generously.
Yes.
And open up this alternative universe of sonic possibilities. So
I had a similar thing with my oboe teacher who was from London, who came here, Barry Davis, to the Conservatorium. So he just turned up when I was about 14, and I started late the oboe. I started at 14 because I'd done clarinet and piano since I was 9. But it was because of him. He just totally opened up my whole world as to what you could do with having someone from the London Symphony Orchestra teaching you when you're 14 years old. And he was so generous. He'd give me 3 lessons a week, 3 hours a lesson. He was a genius pianist as well. So I was so spoiled. I think we're all very lucky back then.
There was a lot of generosity basically, and I think that's one of the things that I'd be looking that we continue as a tradition in Queensland is that giving out into community. So that's a very important part of the reason to be back here now is to recognise that was what was given when I was coming through. And it was Max and Nancy, but I mean even Hugh Brandon, when I was like 10, stopped an AMEB exam to spend an hour teaching me piano. Again, you wouldn't be allowed to do that these days, but these were impacts that one didn't imagine. But when I came to the university, it was with Bernice Lehman in her last year teaching, and that was great because she sort of gave me a sense of sort of European sophistication and identity. And then I had Eugene Ginger, who was very detailed and really took me back to step one and helped me get a serious work ethic and so on. So up until then I'd been really amateur in a lot of my practices as I was sharing, whereas he got me a lot more focused on doing what I was doing.
So after UQ, how did you go to Europe?
I still to this day don't know why I did this, but I applied for a scholarship, Alliance Française scholarship to Paris. I didn't actually know where Paris was. I mean, I knew it was in France, but I didn't know where France was. I knew it was in Europe, but somewhere in Europe.
Yes.
So I remember still outside King's College opening the letter that said I'd won this award and that I'd be going to Paris next year, and I didn't speak French. And
yes, I was going to say, did you speak
all these
French?
Different things. So actually, I got a role teaching piano at Ipswich Girls Grammar School, and that was for the first half of the year. And the second half of the year, I went to Paris. And it was a sort of bizarre experience in that I had set up that I would go to a certain teacher in Strasbourg. But when I arrived in Paris, they told me I wasn't doing that. I would actually be staying in Paris, and I went to the School of Conservatorium with a teacher who, as far as I'm concerned to this day, did some crazy things in her expectations of me, but which also gave me the space to really explore Paris. So Paris was where I first came to understand visual art, first came to understand cinema, and that whole sense of being in an environment which was multi-generational in its feel. And also the first time I experienced winter. And the first time I experienced what it was to not speak the language and be treated as completely dumb.
I've been there, done that.
So I used to live on croissant and
red wine.
jus d'orange, because these were the things I could say. Café crème, s'il vous plaît.
But I remember the feeling. I mean, I had this feeling when I first went to Amsterdam. It just made me want to play Baroque music. I felt so inspired. And I think when you go to places like that where the culture is so different from what we're used to, and it just really inspires you, doesn't it?
I mean, the difference you would have had is you would have had your own instrument, whereas when I was in Paris, I had to literally pay per hour to practice the piano.
Oh my gosh.
And that was great because I was on a very, the Alliance Française scholarship was very generous. And so I could afford 3 hours a day to practice, but I would even have to decide how many of these hours would be on a grand piano because that costs more. But also how many hours you could do that were not on a piano at all. So I think one of the other things that came through that was just learning to be efficient.
Definitely. And also, if you've paid your 3 hours, you probably did your 3 hours.
You prepared for them. I mean, and the other one, of course, was I went to well over 100 concerts in the time I was there. And it was everything from Salle Pleyel, which is the equivalent of Festival Hall or QPAC or whatever, the concert hall here, to Salle Gaveau, which was this little space, and also the Théâtre Champs-Élysées, which is where Rite of Spring was, and so on. So it was these different environments where you heard music, and just so many different great artists.
That's incredible. And so how did you get from France to London?
Well, I went to London once or twice when I was in Paris. In fact, I met up with Stephen Emerson in London. He was in Oxford, so I think I visited him in Oxford. But also he came to Paris, and I met Andrew Schultz in Paris during that time as well. I think it might have been a little bit later. But that idea of seeing the different environment where they did speak English, and so the Paris experience whet my appetite that I wanted to be able to get back to Europe, but to be based in an English environment rather than the sort of the greater challenges.
So you could maximise what you're doing there.
And so I came back I was basically for 2 years back here, and I was head of music at Ipswich Girls Grammar School, and that was a fantastic project because I was asked to set up an orchestra and to transform the musical environment there. So it gave me an experience of what do you do when building from ground up. Principal Judith Hill was completely amazing, just gave me the space and the trust and got things to happen. And also they had a fantastic drama program with Ian and Helen, with Helen Puller, but her husband Ian was also very involved in drama. And so we did I wrote a musical there which we put on, and we just made a lot of music happen.
Oh, wow.
And then I got the Florence Davey Scholarship, which let me go to London. So I was at the Royal College. But it was by that stage I was going there basically as almost like a mature age student ahead of my age, because after you've done a degree, education diploma and you've run a school and that sort of thing, you go back into the educational environment, but you're going in with a different lens. And so
Were you doing piano, or I didn't actually know you were a composer, so...
Oh, no, the piano, the composing thing was just more for fun. I like musicals, but it was absolutely piano, and I was going to Peter Wallfisch in London, and basically he was at the Royal College.
That's Raphael Wallfisch's father.
Exactly, So, and he was absolutely amazing because his background was extraordinary. He was German, Jewish, child prodigy in the 30s who was taken out of Germany to Palestine along with Alexis Weissenberg and
before World War II broke out,
and Mahan Pressler, and so he therefore spoke German, spoke Yiddish,
Hebrew.
Then he, after the war, he was studying with Marguerite Long in Paris, so he spoke French, and then he went to England, and so like English was like his fourth language.
Wow.
But he just knew all of these cultures, and he'd been
Yes.
playing this music all of his life. It was
Yes.
the exact opposite of me. He once told me, for example, when I was learning Beethoven 109, that he really didn't know what it was to learn this piece because he played it as a 9-year-old.
Oh gosh.
And so it was this idea of I can't tell you how to learn it because
Yeah.
it's always been in my system.
Yeah. Wow.
So for me it was a bit like I'd grown up riding horses and I can't easily tell people how to ride horses, and I'm not a very good horse rider, but it was like it's just in your system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not in my system. I'm not a horse rider.
So that was it was
Yeah, but amazing person, and
Extraordinary
and
person,
I mean,
isn't he?
his son's incredible. I think his wife was a Holocaust survivor.
That's right, yeah, Anita, yeah.
Yeah. So it's tough.
Which we didn't, at that stage, that was never discussed.
Mm.
I mean, it was only after Peter passed away in the 90s that she started becoming open about her experience. And of course now she's a global presence in this field.
Yeah.
And like being in front of the Reichstag and sort of
Wow.
said, you must recognize and learn from this experience.
Yeah.
But at that stage it was completely, she was just the cello player in the English Chamber Orchestra, and yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's
So
amazing.
it was a beautiful house, and all my lessons were at their place. I mean, so
Yes.
I'd go for 3-hour lessons on
So
a
again,
regular
the
basis.
generosity is
Yeah.
as well.
And after, he kept teaching me all the way till the week before he died. I mean, so I was at Guildhall.
Still having
I
lessons.
was
when
probably
you were
already teaching you
Yes,
when I was
teaching,
still
yeah.
having some sessions with him.
Wow, that's fantastic.
So it was a long-going mentorship, basically.
Yeah. I certainly saw his son around. I mean, Raphael Wallfisch was teaching at the
Guildhall as well.
so
yeah.
we'd always see him around
Yeah.
the place. I don't think I realised at that time how famous he was, because we didn't have the internet. So if you didn't read it somewhere,
Yeah.
you didn't really know
Yeah.
what was going on.
True. But they were very different from each other, actually, because Peter was more like, it was just this this fantasy exploration that came out on stage when people asked him to play, whereas Raphael was always much more intrinsically professional about
yes, yeah.
the world of the professional artist, actually. And I think that was it was interesting seeing the two of them in that way. I mean, and just even attitudes to things like recordings. I mean, Peter would literally turn up and play it once and say that was good enough. And of course, they were recording for Chandos. I was turning pages, I remember, for Brahms sonatas. And the producer would say to him, well, did you mean this? He said, well, that's what I did. Whereas, of course, Raphael would have been much more aware of the recording generation.
Exactly,
And the editing was going to be really important. Peter was just, the moment is where we live.
Yeah.
And it was quite beautiful.
It might have been a generational thing,
Yeah,
because
completely.
I was just listening to Rachmaninoff's 4th piano concerto.
Yep.
I didn't even know about it, but I was looking into it for some programming, and I found a recording of Michelangelo playing it, and apparently this specific recording, he just played it once.
Yep.
And he said, it's perfect, I don't want to...
Yeah.
But the orchestra's not perfect at all. The
No.
orchestra's dreadful. I'm thinking, I bet the orchestra wanted to fix those takes up, but he refused. So that's the recording.
And I think also it was literally a record.
Yes.
It wasn't meant to be perfection. So actually that time of transition, once the CD came in and you got this concept that you could catch it perfectly for posterity, which obviously in itself proved fallacious, but it was actually that time that they were trying to catch this, make it perfect. Before that, it was like, this is where we were today with this performance. And it was interesting later on working with people like Colin Davis, where again it was wanting to go back to the live performance and capturing that, even if it has some flaws, because in a way it was more authentic.
Exactly, and this is actually one of the little, possibly a silver lining of COVID,
Yeah.
with particularly with how well Melbourne Digital Concert Hall, and now they're the Australian Digital Concert Hall, how quickly and how well they rolled out their initiative. But it was that sort of perfection, fake perfection, let's say, was sort of put aside to let's get a realistic alternative to a live concert here.
Yeah, and for me, it came to later on. Obviously, the last decade or so, I've been producing recordings, and I suddenly realised that if you're playing a major piece, and you were doing it with these short takes, it would be like walking up sort of Mount Everest, but stopping and showering every 300 meters.
Exactly.
And having a rest and doing the next bit. So of course it's perfect in one sense, but it's not true. So I was really lucky in Singapore that we could start exploring games we might play to get closer to the live experience without compromising the material. So with Albert Chu, the pianist, he would play entire sonatas on 3 consecutive days into the recording studio.
Yes.
So you could just take the best of those big takes, but then the climax 25 minutes in was legitimately played 25 minutes in.
That's, and I think a lot of orchestras are doing that now.
Yeah,
they're recording for performances. Because the other thing I have found when I've been recording is I actually usually do my best right up.
Yeah.
But it may not be perfect, and as we get going, I keep trying to do it more perfect, that I completely lose the excitement. So a live concert's always going to have more, absolutely more passionate music making than a recording session.
It's interesting to see how those aesthetics have changed over time. So, and also that you can hear in some of those recordings in the 90s that the focus was more on getting it right than getting it to express. So it's been interesting to live through some of those transformations.
Absolutely, and it has a big effect on, all of us mentally, and the young people coming up, because it's a bit like the world of the supermodel.
Yes.
Where every photo, they look perfect and it's been airbrushed, and it means the young people, the young kids, the young girls are looking for this perfection that is actually not really attainable because it doesn't really exist.
Yeah.
I think as musicians, in a way, we need to not think that all of, you have to be a superhero. You should be able to make a mistake, and it shouldn't have a bad, connotation if your overall performance was exciting.
And also that thing of what are you trying to express? So, and is it really the notes or is it feelings behind the notes? For me, one of the things that's been actually positive out of COVID is to remember why we have art, because the risk became art was getting commoditized into these perfectly formed Louis Vuitton type performances, rather than the concept of it being crafted and shared in its moment. So going back to that idea that it's live, there's people here, we're connecting, it's true, it's human. These were the things that have come back to the fore. The whole thing with COVID, I've
been actually really heartened to realise that, or people are suddenly realising that arts is valuable.
Yeah.
I think it's when it was all taken away and it wasn't there anymore, people were suddenly going, oh, we do value it.
The full experience, exactly.
In our lives.
To be in the hall. So one of the things was just to be in that acoustic, whereas before people would take that acoustic for granted, but when you were living every day in the living room with limited resonance and so on, and then to go into this space with more people and more sonority.
Yeah.
No, it's hopefully we come out and grow through it. But
well, I found, it's throughout the whole arts, I think, particularly with film and television, the fact that they couldn't even do their, they had to shut down production and things
Yeah.
like that. And the effect of that a year later, when there's no new television shows coming in there, and suddenly go, goodness, entertainment is actually a really intrinsic part of everyone's daily life, and we need it to relax after our grinding jobs and things like that. So
and that's been one of the things coming back here, because obviously the last 6 months in Queensland have been incredibly privileged in terms of access to live art, and it's been a really great time to be here. I mean, because I've seen some extraordinary new stuff, and being director here, there's a huge diversity of music. So it's one of the myths is that we're predominantly a classical program, but actually the majority of students here aren't classical. So going to plays, going to musical theatre, going to pop events,
and jazz,
going into jazz and so on. So,
music,
and then also just seeing some of the theatrical productions like Return to the Dirt or Boy Swallows Universe, and so stuff that's coming more authentically out of here now. And so the one thing is it gives you entertainment, and it's been great to go to something which was complete release from the normal life. With its challenges, the complete release being for me going to the musical of The Wedding Singer, where when I was going down to Burke Street where it was, I was thinking, why do I want this tonight? It's been a tough day.
Yeah.
Versus, the sort of Boy Swallows Universe, which had its sort of dimensions where I could really relate to some of the elements of the story, or the depth and challenge of, what did I see? For example, Return to the Dirt or Away, Michael Gough's play. Michael Gough's play, which are really getting into deep truths of human identity. So it's been great to see all this different activity.
Absolutely. So you became, were you deputy?
I was a director,
arts at the Guildhall School.
At Guildhall, yes, of music, yes.
And so, how long were you in that position?
15 years.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, that's not true. 13 years.
13 years.
Yeah, I was in Guildhall for 16 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's an exciting. I loved being there. I feel, actually, I miss it a lot. Of all the places, I really miss it was a fantastic school.
It was a fantastic time to be there as well, because the sort of late 80s, 90s through to the beginning of the 2000s. Phenomenal talent coming through, and just also there was an incredibly experimental school. We got our knuckles wrapped in the early 21st century because we were apparently not conforming to what the systems would require that was happening in the rest of the British education system.
Yes.
But looking back 20 years later, I would say Guildhall was getting that aspect more right for an art school, rather than these sort of controlling phenomenon that came into some of the other schools.
I can imagine, because I didn't get a BMUS, a Bachelor of Music there.
Oh, you're still before that?
Yeah,
right.
I'm an associate of the Guildhall School of Music, 4-year degree.
Yep.
But after being at the con, I was at Young Con, and I did 6 months at the con before I went to London. But our history courses were practical. We had early music, the best early music practitioners in London come and do early music with us. So we had the top Baroque flute player. We had the best contemporary art music practitioners come in, and we did whole big contemporary sessions. Our harmony harmony lessons were in small groups where we had to learn to realise a figured bass on the piano. From all of this stuff. I remember
I was teaching it.
And what was amazing is back here we would have been doing theory. It would have been sort of your Bach chorales and harmonising, and we would have done history and learned. But it was fantastic the way we learned all those things. Yeah. And I think we learned it just as well, having a really practical education as if it had been a really academic.
Yeah, so I mean, for me, that was the thing that attracted me to Guildhall. I didn't literally know that Guildhall existed when I got to London. So well done for finding it.
Well, I had luckily Anthony Camden.
Anthony Camden.
So my teacher, Barry Davis, was sending me to Anthony Camden,
right,
who was the principal of the LSO. But Anthony Camden literally came to be the head of the con here 1 week after I arrived.
Oh, I see.
So I had lessons with him in London for that week, but I learned from the most incredible oboe player, David Theodore, who was in the BBC Symphony Orchestra. But so I was always going to go to the Guildhall because of Anthony.
Because you knew about Anthony. Okay,
yeah.
that makes sense. Because I only knew the Royals, and I actually only went to the Royal College because that's where Peter Wallfisch was. I wanted to go and have private lessons, and I had the funding to do it, but it was just that he said it's going to be easier for a visa to be obviously in a program. So I was actually in the first master's program at the Royal College, because the Royal College had the degree awarding powers conferred upon it probably by Queen Victoria or something, and so therefore they were allowed to do it when other schools really struggled with that sort of thing. But when I first got there, I was looking after one of the halls of residence. You probably met her with Henry Wood House. Yeah. And I was meeting students from Guildhall who I thought were just basically the most interesting students I was coming across in London, and I was really lucky because they were telling me about this one course, which you probably did with Paul Roberts, Style and Interpretation, in first year.
No, I didn't, because I wasn't on I was on the performance course, so I don't think I did.
Well, certainly by the time I was teaching it, everyone did it, but it was basically everybody just came and played to each other, and your job as a teacher was to share with everyone what might be interesting to listen for and how to improve this piece. So it was literally a jazz singer would turn up and sing a song, and somebody else would turn up and play a Bach solo partita movement. Oh, wow. And a pianist would come and play a Mussorgsky etude or something, and you just had to try and share with everyone what they might be listening for and what was going on the interpretive side. Yeah. But these, of course, were first-year undergraduates, so there was a point where they weren't ready for that to be taken too far.
Yeah,
but it was actually
sounds like more postgrad.
So a lot of people later on just wished that it said to me, I wish that it had been later. But for me, when I was hearing about it before I went to Guildhall, it's fantastic. So it was very funny, just 3 or 4 years later, to be teaching it there, and so that's why the sort of Guildhall thing sort of emerged. And but actually, it's interesting about the degree, because the break for me in London was the point between the associate and graduate programs moving to the degree, because there was some concern amongst certain academics that the students coming through weren't degree worthy. And I wrote this huge paper for no reason whatsoever other than sort of some sort of inner drive about what I thought were reasons that you could value practical application as degree worthy. So the paper was actually called Degrees of Value, and the idea that what is valuable. And so in the early 90s, there was this perception that unless it was purely academic, it somehow wasn't worthy of a degree. But by the end of the 90s, that had completely shifted.
Oh, that's good
so it was actually, but that paper was the reason that Robin Bowman, who you must have known actually, who was head of academic studies at the time, said, well, we want you to do some more involvement with Guildhall. And then later on, the assistant director role came up, which was a very competitive process.
I can imagine,
Crazy. I've never been involved in a audition process like that one.
No, and they gave it to an Australian.
And honestly, I think they gave it partly because they thought I would behave myself because I was very young. And because I had some very big names that were sort of going for it. Yeah. But literally the day involved, the first thing was having to sight conduct Stravinsky's octet in a rehearsal where the students couldn't play it.
Oh, goodness.
Then it was do a program write a report on Paul Lewis playing the Dante Sonata of Liszt. Then it was share a rehearsal schedule for the Britten Requiem for Colin Davis in St Paul's Cathedral. And it was just like these, and coach Dvorak piano quintet. So I was like,
wow.
And you just literally went from one room to the other, and you had no idea of any of this. What's happening next? It was almost like one of these TV programs.
Sounds like Squid Games for the music.
It's crazy. And then the end of that, you had lunch with the other 4 final candidates.
Yes.
And then you had to go and do your interview after all that. It was just bizarre. So I thought that was a joke, and I've got no chance of that. And then that was where I got that wrong.
Oh, maybe because you didn't take it too serious.
Well, I think it was also that they thought, oh, he'll learn.
Yeah.
But Guildhall was always good for that. It wasn't that you already had to have proven yourself. And they, as you say, they got the best people. They often got them young.
Yes.
And then they'd try and work through with them. So it was a good culture then.
Yeah, and I mean, look, it was exciting. I think with the whole being in a drama school as well.
Exactly.
I mean, the actors. It was one of the top drama schools. Yeah. So we were sort of sharing a foyer space with people who became
major names,
super famous. So. Yeah, it was a really exciting place to study.
You know, I used to teach them.
The drama students.
Yeah, I used to teach them first year music reading.
Okay, yeah.
And that was fantastic because you got a completely different understanding of music through their eyes and ears. And
well, they collaborated with we did the what's the musical with the 3 sailors who get off in Coney Island.
Yes, that one. Yep.
And I know that Ewan McGregor was one of those.
Yep.
And I went to it. It was so fantastic. It was so professional.
No, it was great. No, it was great. But that was the only musical they did, of course. Because there was one a year, but they were all acting students. They weren't musical theatre.
No, not the music.
But it was funny because obviously Ewan actually played French horn and had some musical background, whereas some of them, they discovered their voice for the first time.
Yeah.
And but exactly the energy level. I mean, just like when you're choosing 24 students out of 1,000 applicants,
the level was really good. Yeah, I just wish I could go back in time and realise, you know, what was actually going on
around you.
Because I was too busy worrying about, you know, how was I going to pay my rent and had I not done enough practice and that sort of thing.
No. So it's actually trying to get. That's one of the things here is trying to get students to realise the extraordinary environment we're in on the South Bank. I mean, and just this is your chance in life to have so many things going on within 400 metres of you. Yeah. From the film school or QCA through to QPAC. Yeah. And all the stuff like Brisbane Festival on the waterfront and so on. It's just so many exciting
yourself.
things. Just to, because I think historically we've all thought until you go somewhere else. Yes. It's not really happening. Whereas now in Brisbane, it's as exciting as anywhere, I think.
Well, that's right. I mean, Australia's really changed. I think it's a lot of it's to do with your generation, my generation, or coming back.
Yeah.
And I think realising that we actually live in one of the best places in the entire world.
Completely.
And there's no reason the level of arts can't be at the same level as it is in Europe. Really.
But for me, that's also, it's about growing it out of the ground that is here. I mean, so rather than replicating something that belongs better somewhere else. I mean, you know, we're not probably going to grow peaches in Cairns. I mean, because the environment's not going to work for it, and it's a little bit the same. How do we hear authentically what comes out of here? So one of the really powerful ones for me has been coming back into thinking through the whole acknowledgement of ownership of land and the idea of thousands of years of culture that have been here. And we are the next generation of this environment. And to hear from those peoples who've inhabited this land as to that being part of what we might create, along with the interactions of so many cultures that have come here since. And therefore I think it's really exciting that there's commissions going on and that there's new work coming through.
Absolutely, yeah. And creating our own uniquely Australian sound rather than trying to emulate, you know, Europeans or Americans.
Exactly, and yet with respect for all of those cultures. So you're drawing out, you are at this point in time, so you're drawing on your knowledge base from all of that material. But I mean, just the other day we gave Katie Noonan an honorary doctorate and just hearing what she does as an identity that's grown authentically out of here,
exactly,
and with the skill set she's got from keyboard to arranging to composition to voice, and that she's found a way that is uniquely hers. So it's actually seeing alumni like that coming through and actually saying this is what you should be looking at as much as the traditional sort of pathways.
Exactly.
Alongside, it's not to diminish those either, but to just say there's so many possibilities.
Well, that's one of the things I like about Brisbane coming back is I think things are very possible here.
Yep. No, and facilities, everything.
You're not. Life isn't too crazy. That you, I don't know. That things are. The opportunities are there if you are wanting to take them.
Well, that's what I think is really like. You can go to, like, there's more than enough here, but you're not so overwhelmed that.
That's right.
That you should be able to get to pretty much everything that's really strong here. Not entirely, because there's some clashes I know I've had to live, but there's so much going on.
Yeah.
And then, as you say, the environment is just fantastic, and drawing out of the environment is as important as drawing out of the people. And that idea that once you're in Europe, as you know, it gets to winter, everything goes dark, you're very inside. Whereas here, you can be drawing inspiration all year from what's outside. So, a lot of stuff. Yeah. And also, for me, it's interesting coming from Southeast Asia to here, because it would have been one thing to come from London direct to here, but I'm seeing this with a different lens because of the 15 years
because of
in
Singapore. So that's what I was going to ask you. So you went from the Guildhall to being the head of the Yong Siew Toh Conservatorium at the National University of Singapore, where we came, Southern Cross Scholars came and we did a residency. That was so much fun, I have to say. I was so impressed with the entire conservatorium, the staff you've got, the artistic team, everything. It was just fantastic, and such an interesting intake of international students as well. Yeah,
but I must say it's got a lot better since then. I mean, it was
great
the
then.
Speed it grew up afterwards was just mind blowing.
Yeah,
and just the way in which Singapore embraces contemporary digital technologies and so on. So, like for the last few years, everything's been live streamed, everything is being produced and reimagined, and I think it's actually somewhere now where people really need to look at who are the people coming through. So it's a similar sort of thing to Australia. Is when you start having authentic young artists evolving from a community, that's the tipping point. And it's been so exciting. But at that point where you were coming, where it was
quite young,
just on the edge of beginning to believe it could be something, whereas it's now, I think, a lot more self-believing. And also that becomes about what is authentically Southeast Asian, and as you say, a lot of the students were international. But when I went there, I went as deputy, and I went there for 12 months to have an escape from Guildhall for a bit of alternative experience, because I'd been in Guildhall for 15 years.
Warm weather.
So it was, actually that was the one thing I didn't want. I actually really enjoyed the British climate.
Yeah, it's hot, not just
all
hot,
the time.
It's crazy hot.
And wet as well. So, but it was this thing of when I got there, it was, the circumstances meant, again, as with London, the speed of transition. I mean, my first year in both London and in Singapore were profound in terms of my personal journey, and I was very lucky. I mean, I think things fell into place, and it was the right time to be in both places. Yeah.
Well, after doing the residency there, I was, like I said, I was so impressed. Then when I came back I was teaching here and at UQ. I then started recommending to my students that they don't go to do what I did. They don't go to Europe or London and try to, it's just so expensive. It was such a struggle from a financial perspective for me. I had scholarships, but my whole profession was getting scholarships, basically, writing scholarship applications and working, and it was a very stressful way to be studying. And so I sort of said to my students, don't go, or any students actually, you don't need to go to Europe. Just either go somewhere else in Australia or go to Singapore. It's the best setups in Singapore. I mean, with Lee Wei teaching the cello there, I'm like, well, why would you go to London? Just go to Lee Wei in Singapore.
Yeah, I think also the other one is, so we're going to be looking from Queensland to tie connections to Singapore, so there's a bit of exchange, because obviously, once planes are allowed to fly again and not be ridiculously expensive, then it's like Scoot from Gold Coast as it was to Singapore is actually really cheap, and therefore you could look at some potential exchange which would be mutually valuable. So to get some greater Asian presence into the conservatorium here would be really healthy. To get these students into that environment and seeing what is there and getting those students to see these students, I think could also be really healthy. So there's some potential projects that we need to try and realise. And it's also about staff development. I mean, as you folks saw when you were there, just going into a new environment helps you find each other and helps you reimagine what you might do.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
and I think also a lot of the really top soloists, sometimes they'll visit Singapore but not come to Australia, which
and
seems
that's the
crazy.
other one I want to work on, because obviously I've been really fortunate in the quality of people I've been able to work through and connect with in Singapore. So I have well-established relationships with some really major figures, and you're right, they don't come here, whereas if we can get them to see the potential of this, and that's why the link to QPAC becomes really important. And again, I think the challenge has always been trying to get them to come and do an Australian tour or something.
Yeah, that's
they
right.
haven't got time for that.
No.
But if we could get them to just come and do a few days here and show an experience, they come for an experience. I mean, so they're not going to come here and find a better orchestra than the Berlin Philharmonic or a better ensemble or whatever, but they can come for an experience that feeds them. And also, I had a really major conductor once said to me, if I come to Singapore, I want to learn something about music that I would not have learnt before the journey. So I don't come here just to share my knowledge. I'm also trying to see or hear music through a different set of ears. And that's a little bit the way we've got to play it, is come here for a different experience. Yeah. But that could also be that we look at collaborations with Singapore, and therefore, send 5 or 6 students up there for a project they're doing, because it's not a big school. They'll always be grateful for 1 or 2 more players in there.
That's right. Well, that's what I'm thinking. If the soloists will go to Singapore and they won't come here, we can just pop over to Singapore and.
Exactly, and it's the same. Like Masaki Suzuki comes to Singapore every year to do something that's related to Bach, and he brings his ensemble from some of the players from his ensemble in Japan down. Now, if you wanted to do a Baroque project, go and do that with Masaki Suzuki. And literally, that was Masaki Suzuki came to my office in Singapore and said, "Would you like me to do something here?" Fantastic. It was just like, what? And it was it was that he actually liked coming to Singapore in January for a break from Japan, because it was the nicest month in Singapore. It was slightly cooler, but it was an escape from Tokyo. And so he just had a couple of weeks holiday there and just did a week's residence with us. So there's people like that, where if we know about them. Exactly.
And so you started here back in Queensland. August. So literally 4 months.
Yep. Yeah.
Fantastic. Wow.
Yeah.
So how has it been coming back to where it all began, almost?
Well, it's a really funny thing, because there's real ways in which I don't think I ever lived in this city before, although I obviously spent 5 years living here.
At UQ.
At UQ, and then also I lived in Toowong when I was in Ipswich. So, but it's just like so much has evolved. And for example, they opened QPAC after I left Brisbane. So none of this South Bank existed.
84, I think it was.
Yeah, maybe it was 85.
85, yeah.
Yeah, beginning of 85, because I left at the beginning of 85.
85, that's right, yeah.
And then just stuff like, I ride a bicycle everywhere here, and the paths and the way you can get around is just phenomenal. None of that was there when I was here before. So there's that side of it has evolved. I think it's been interesting just to see the cultural evolutions in the 35 years since, because it's 35 years, so it's quite a long time. But it's also, I mean, there's also stuff that I can see opportunities that are not yet fully realised here. I mean, just because when I was in Southeast Asia, I was also very active across all of Asia, so particularly in China and Japan, as well as Southeast, all over Southeast Asia. So I was, for 10 years, I was president of the Southeast Asian Directors of Music, where we were really trying to make sure that the musicians of Southeast Asia knew each other. But if you look at music in Southeast Asia, it's incredibly diverse. You know, between Cambodia or Vietnam or Myanmar or Indonesia, the authentic local musics alongside the sort of colonized interactions has been really interesting. And also there's a way in which Southeast Asia is like a mini version of the world, because it's been taken over at different times by a range of different European cultures. So in there you've got Portugal, Holland, France, England, you know, all of these have had those influences, and they've had different influences on different countries.
Yeah, and even Russia,
and then Russia, China, America since, I mean, Philippines, for example, Spanish in Philippines. So you've got all these different cultural interactions, and then you've also got different financial circumstances. From Singapore now ranked, I think, 2 or 3 in the world, down to, I don't know what the most depressed, probably Laos actually, but it would be in the about 150 in the world. And then you've also got all the religions. So you've got Christianity, Buddhism, Muslim, it's all there.
And Singapore is certainly the melting pot of Southeast Asia, with every single nationality you could think of.
Yeah, and then you have all the complex ways of hearing music. I mean, we took a group of first-year students to Myanmar when Aung San Suu Kyi was still free, and they literally were working with some wine ensemble where they're not allowed to write music down and they're not allowed to count it. So these ensembles are playing with no notated music permitted, and with no numbering system to be attached to music. So because it was all seen as, in digital terms here, it's all seen as quantization of sound and of a human experience, which should not be translated into something on paper or something that is measured.
So they've got incredible memories, obviously.
So they have that, as indeed did we. We could remember stories before we were told you could write them down.
Yes.
And they also had this capacity to feel each other. So if you ever want to understand what happens at a cadence point, go and listen to a Sign One ensemble where sort of 10 people will slow down like a train would slow down coming into a train station. It's exponential. It's much more spacious than us where we're measuring the slowing. It's feeling the slow.
It's a bit like what we do in Southern Cross Solos with chamber music, where we just know, you just do it together. You don't have to put anyone in charge or even say anything. That takes from a lot of years of playing together, of course.
But there's also that thing though of imagine music that never had a bar line.
Yeah.
So we learn over time to let go of the bar lines, but we've been enculturated into seeing them before we can hear that they're a potential barrier.
No, absolutely.
So it was just that idea of different perspectives of what we think is the same experience.
Yeah, no.
So just one more Myanmar story is that every mother creates for every child a lullaby that is distinctive to that child.
Wow.
And that idea that everybody therefore owns their own song.
Yeah. This is something I find fascinating. I actually have always been interested in why did music pop up in every single culture in the entire world before there was any communication, and there's music or rhythm, dance as part of every single culture. And there is a book that I started reading, I can't remember the author, but it's just come out, it's English, I think.
Right.
It's about humans and music, and it's trying to go back to find out why it's such an essential part. I'll have to remember the name of it.
So I think that, I've done some work in this, and I think some of it is, like, at one level, it is the child experience. You're holding the child and you're wanting to calm it to sleep. So that's going to be the source of lullaby and of metaphor, because it's going to be a warm experience for the child, and you're going to see smiles and so on. So there's a whole pile of stuff that comes out of that.
Yes.
And then there's the release thing, which will come into the dance and so on. So
Exactly.
it's part of our well-being.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting because for some reason my music on my phone was on the Rite of Spring on the way in here, and I was thinking, I've been listening to listening at the moment has been very random. I've been listening to Russian gypsy folk songs, which they don't have any bar lines, and it's just fascinating what they do. But then to Stravinsky, Rite of Spring, where you've got that absolute sort of pagan, guttural, rhythmic drive, and every single note's interesting and exciting, and it's all of these different things that, I don't know, affect us as human beings. That,
So that's one of the things we'll be looking to do here, is reimagine what should happen in the theory space. So it should be the theory of how you process music, and there's a risk if you regiment it too much, you stop listening and feeling and start thinking.
Exactly. Yes.
And sort of, so the rational takes over. So we're going to try and get back into this sense of feeling and
why.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's going to be, I think, an important component of this,
Yeah.
which is happening, I think, in the broader landscape, and also what does the choices we make in music tell us about our cultures or our relationship with each other and so on. So there was a point where it was all about your singular experience and growth, whereas obviously what's becoming much more meaningful in art again is the collective and the ensemble. So in that way, Southern Cross is a really perfect example of people who are expressing themselves together without being commanded by somebody who's telling them what to do. So from a cultural perspective, I think it's a different positioning.
Yes.
It's great.
So you've been here for 4 months.
Yep.
What's the plans? I know you're going to London tomorrow for Christmas.
Not tomorrow now, but I'm beginning my trip to London tomorrow.
You're lucky that we can.
Well, we'll see. I'm not even sure it'll happen.
If you'll be able to travel or not. Well, the plan is to go back for Christmas. But what's the plans for next year? Have you got much?
Well, here actually, a lot of what was planned for next year was already in place. And so I'm not really responsible for that, except to manage it. Whereas that's been in a way healthy, because it can be much more about what we evolve towards in 23.
Yes, so you've been able to do the big picture, longer term
and
planning.
For me, some of that's going to be it's actually about creating a scaffolding that looks sideways across the student group, as well as through the different genres and instrumental groupings that has been the more standard project here, so that you end up with this sort of greater awareness from the students of each other in a cohort. So next year even we're going to be doing a lot more, which is about helping the first years know each other across the board. What is their musics? What are their drivers?
So promoting collaboration and using the students to motivate each other.
Using students to motivate each other, but also just getting them to listen to each other, because actually they haven't had that much opportunity up until now through the educational system to be experiencing music that they themselves weren't making.
Yes.
So one of the things I really want to focus on in the first trimester is that they're listening to what's around them in the concert spaces. So for example, we've got concerts that we'll sort of designate in the first trimester. We would ask them to try and get to.
Yes.
Like whether it's a Music of Eva concert or something that's in the hall, even a pop singer or a jazz percussionist.
Well, I was thinking the jazz department. I know they're up there, and classical students are usually over there.
Yeah. So basically, this would be more. Well, if you're that, make sure you've gone to something that you don't fully understand.
Yeah. And
have that experience, even if it's a once-off and you've only seen it and that's it.
Yeah.
But the same with the classical, and also this idea that very few of our students coming in are only that one thing. We risk putting them in that one thing because that might be what they're best at.
That's right.
And some of this was about coming back by a reconsideration of myself as a child. I mean, I was playing all these different musics, but also I was exposed to a range of different things, from singing to brass band to percussion to composition and so on. And actually all of that's in me in some way.
Yeah.
And I think that's the same with the majority of Queensland students coming through, for example.
Yeah.
And just how do we help that grow? And if you think about the Mozarts and the Bachs and the Beethovens and the Britons, they all had this diversity of musical background as well.
Well, as I get more advanced in my career, I wish I can't improvise and play jazz. I don't.
And that's also important.
And I'm, it'd be so scary to do that. And I don't even know where you start. And I'd love to know how do they start?
Well, actually, ironically, that's actually really easy, and it's sort of really obvious once you realise it. And one of the first things we'll do is a shared creative project here with no notation, and literally just getting them to cross their genres and make some music together. But there's a very simple way to start, which is just limit yourself to one pitch. It can be any register, but then also that pitch and silence and some play with rhythm.
Yes.
And that's where you start just feeling what happens with that pitch.
Yes.
And so that's one of the first things we'll get to do with the first years, is actually just to think, like if you end up just giving us a drone, or we might say, well, you're allowed 3 pitches that repeat or something, so that something that's really containable, that gives you space for play. Because one of the things that's happened by us all being obsessed with other people's repertoire is that we think there's a right way to repeat that thing.
Yes.
Whereas actually, what we want is that this is like a first time.
Yeah, you've got to be allowed to fail, basically, and not feel...
Well, to play, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, it's when you miss when you miss the basket, you don't think I failed. You throw it again, and you keep on trying to get it. So you don't. Whereas our system, by being judged, risks being, I missed the basket, I'll never do it again.
I played a wrong note. Yes. Yeah.
So it's actually a little bit get into that play spirit.
Yeah, that's right.
And the flow space.
Yeah,
basically.
I mean, I've been doing with Baroque. I actually am comfortable doing it in Baroque music and folk music, actually. Yeah. But the actual jazz music, not.
Well, then that's another. That gets more sophisticated, admittedly.
Yeah. I need to go back and learn harmony for that. But
great.
Anyway, look, Bernard, it has been so lovely to catch up after all these years.
Yes, it is.
Someone who's actually was very important in my life all those years ago. Actually, I think you helped me with some grant writing back then.
I vaguely remember, actually.
And I
think in one of those basement rooms.
Yes, I think I still use certain phrases you taught me to use when I wrote a grant. So thank you, because I got through my degree at the Guildhall School of Music. And look, it's lovely that you're back here in Queensland. It's fantastic to have you. And I can't wait to see, what you've got planned in the next few years.
It should be exciting. Well, it's been a really exciting time to come back. And the staff here are really fantastic. It's actually just about
really good time
energizing a reimagined curriculum that's a little bit more open.
Yeah.
But and there's more on the process and more on the students being able to play for each other rather than us trying to emulate our neighbours who do very good professional activity. No, it's very exciting. And I look forward to coming along to more events next year. Thanks, Tania. Great to see you. Thanks so much, Bernard, and I'll hope to see you soon. Thanks. Thank you. Cheers.